Thank you for the applause, but I haven't even said anything yet. Welcome to today's Rancho Mirage Writers Festival Writer Series program. We're so pleased to have you all here with us. Before we get started, please make sure you silence your cell phones. I know Debbie, if you were in attendance on Tuesday, Debbie asked for everybody to silence their phones, and I counted 3 people's phones that went off. So please silence your phones. Did you just say it was yours, Jamie? Oh, Jamie. Oh. So this year, the Rancho Mirage Writer Series gave back to the community by co-sponsoring the Western Wind Writing Contest with the Western Wind Foundation. The contest gave 7th grade students from 5 Palm Springs Unified School District middle schools the chance to express themselves through essays about overcoming adversity. We are honored to have one of our winners today, so please join me in welcoming Elias Racinos from Cielo Vista Charter to the stage.
Hello, everybody. My name is Elias Racinos. I wrote this about a year ago. It's about Gaza, and it was a big topic around this time last year. The story is called Gaza and Rainbow, and I'd like to share it to you guys. Satisfying was the feel between our toes in the fresh-watered grass in the early summer while we stood in the soccer field facing the sunrise. How the colors from the sky danced with the morning breeze, bouncing through the trees and leaving the apartment windows, like a rainbow shielding our town, a reminder of God's love, mercy, and peace. Esau, a red-headed, freckled-faced teen, so goofy yet caring, brave, and resilient. He is my first cousin, more like my twin brother. We were born a week apart. Him being the oldest, our mothers are sisters, both from Jewish descent. Yet we were both born in Bethlehem. We both have dual citizenship, Israel delivered from our parents and Palestinian from our birthplace. We grew up together in West Jerusalem until we both turned 13, and Esau's father protested to celebration of his bar mitzvah and forced them to move to Gaza, where they live now. I still do not comprehend how faith in the same God of our Abraham creates so much diversion among Jews, Muslims, and Christians in this region of the world. A few months prior, one of the greatest tragedies in our nation's history occurred. We both turned 18 years. I was in West Jerusalem, and I was mandated to serve in the Israel Defense Forces. I went as a combat medic. Esau and myself pursued the medical field. We both had a strong desire to help and save victims of tragedy. Esau was in the internship program in Ali Hospital in Gaza. He would assist nurses and doctors in the emergency area. At times, to continue his goofy persona, he would paint his face with the Superman logo to the recovering children and volunteer to face their pains if feasible. Children and parents adored him. The word had gone around Gaza. Esau was a servant and healer of his community. But I remember that day, October 17th, 2023, the day where all hell broke loose. I was in my bed, deep in my blankets, moments before I woke up from my mom's grieving. I walked barefoot down across the long wooden hallway of our apartments. Mom, what's wrong? I could not understand what she was trying to say in the moment. All I remember was hearing her trembling voice say, Abraham, the hospital got bombed. I couldn't feel my bare feet anymore. My body went numb. My face pale. I went cold. I could not speak that well. I felt like if I was getting choked by the throat. I remember saying, where's Esau? I need to see him, please, I need to see him. My mom looked at me with a face emotionless. I looked at her with my eyes feeling tense. God took Abraham. God knew he was too good for this world. I'm sorry. I felt hot tears falling down my face and breaking the numb feeling in my body. My mom went over to hug me, but I stepped back. I felt like if I were to have hugged her, I would have crumbled, shattered into a million pieces of glass. Esau always wanted the best for people. He said his dream was to save all the people from pain because he believed people deserved so much better than that. I admired the amount of faith he had in humans. The smell of the munitions from the artillery had scared me. Never will I be able to erase the feeling when I heard the words of death come out my mother's mouth. Sometimes I feel that death would be a blessing. That hurt is at times unbearable, and question is antagonizing. Live to serve and heal, yet killed by radicalized ideologies. Esau did not deserve to die, not by war. He had no enemies. He would attend any wounded being, whether person or animal. He was that caring and selfless and righteous. What is wrong with this world? What is wrong with those in power? When will we all realize? Sunset has arrived, and the colors of the sky reflect off the broken windows and blasted buildings, again creating the effect of a rainbow, hoping it shields the city of Gaza. Truth is, a rainbow has no beginning or end. It is a full circle. To Esau, the rainbow is a ring, our Creator's promise, a ring of everlasting love, peace to this world. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you, Elias, for that moving reading. We're truly inspired, and we're so proud of your achievement. We could not bring today's program without the support and vision of one remarkable individual, as much as I wanted to give him a little bit harder time on his phone. So, Jamie, please stand for a heartfelt thank you for all that you do. We also need to recognize Jordan Snitzer for his amazing support of our writer series. It is his single support through his foundation that we are able to support the writer series 100% free of charge to the community. So please give a We're also incredibly grateful for the support from our city council. So if I could please have the city council stand. Mayor Ted Weil, Mayor Pro Tem Lynn Mulatto, Michael O'Keefe, and Councilmember Steve Downs. It is through their incredible support that the Library and Observatory, along with the Writers Festival, is allowed to thrive as a cultural and educational hub for our community. I also want to give a special thanks to our incredible staff at the Rancho Mirage Library and Observatory for their hard work, their dedication to make programs like this and everything that we do throughout the year. We are so grateful for their passion and commitment to excellence. So thank you to our staff. Today, I'd also like to take a special moment to recognize someone whose work is undoubtedly seen but may not be realized. If you've ever admired our marketing materials of the Rancho Mirage Writers Festival or our digital and print materials for the Library and Observatory, you have seen the incredible talent of Rachel Horowitz, our art director. We are so fortunate to have her here today, so please join me in giving Rachel a well-deserved round of applause. Thank you, Rachel, for all you do. It was great to embarrass you in front of all these people. So thank you for driving from Phoenix for just that. We have many more exciting Writer Series programs ahead, and I encourage you to check out the program guides or pick up a Writer Series rat card for more information. One that I do want to highlight is next week's program, Tuesday, March 11th at 2 p.m. We will welcome a truly special presentation, The Most Human, Reconciling with My Father, Leonard Nimoy. You won't want to miss it. After today's program, Molly will be signing books at the front of the room up here. If you would please line up along the wall, and we will get you over there as quickly as we can. I also want to encourage you, if you were not able to get a free book, Follett, our partner, is here also selling additional books. And now on today's program, it is my great pleasure to introduce Molly Guptill Manning. Molly is an acclaimed author, known for her works of When Books Went to War and War on Words. When Books Went to War tells us a remarkable story of how books became weapons in World War II, uplifting the spirits of soldiers through armed services editions. War on Words delves into the power of literature and the fight against censorship during wartime. Her books bring history to life and remind us of the enduring impacts of books and literacy. I want to encourage everyone to also explore the 3-part exhibit here in our library lobby and along next to our Chihuly. The exhibit, which is beautifully complements Molly's work, will be decommissioned tomorrow, so please make sure you get it before it's gone. Joining Molly on stage is our very own Justice Doug Miller. So please join me in welcoming Justice Doug Miller and Molly Guptill Manning.
Thank you, Aaron.
Good afternoon and welcome. So when Jamie asked me to read these 2 books, he knew that I loved history. But you're in for a treat because these books are not only interesting, well-written, but it's on topics I didn't know anything about. So Molly, welcome to the desert. I know that this is your second trip back, but welcome and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much.
But can I do something first?
Sure.
So we have a special guest here with Molly, and if I could get Beatrice, her daughter, just to walk up and say hello and wave. Thank you for letting your mom come to talk to us. So these books hit a place in my heart, and I'm going to do something a little different. Normally, I just jump right in and start to ask questions of the author, but I have to say something as to why these books were so emotional to me, and I'm going to try to do it without crying. When my grandmother, my dad's mother, passed away, and we went up to a little town in Utah, Spanish Fork, to clean out her home, in her Chester drawers, in her bedroom, in the bottom drawer, were my dad's uniforms from World War II. And as I went through those, I found a letter. And on the outside of that letter, where you would write the address of the sender, it said, somewhere in the South Pacific Sea. My dad was on his way to Okinawa with his Marine unit. He wrote this letter on his 18th birthday. I asked my dad many times what it was like to be in the war, what it was like to be on Okinawa. Every time he refused to tell me. About 2 months before he passed away, when he was 87, I asked him again. I figured I didn't have many more times to ask him. And he started to cry. And his answer took only about 5 seconds. I've remembered it ever since then, and I can repeat it perfectly. He told me, quote, every day on Okinawa was like the opening scenes of Saving Private Ryan. Wow. End of quote. That's all he said. So these books touched my heart because part of it was something that happened in Okinawa. Part of it was that I didn't know anything about this. So Molly, I want to talk first about When Books Went to War. What inspired you to write that book?
I was actually working on my first book at the time, and it was by about an author named Arthur Train, who was like the John Grisham of the early 20th century. And he ended up having 2 of his books made into armed services editions. And so I was going through archives, and there was these file folders filled with letters from overseas saying how much they enjoyed his paperback. He didn't have a paperback because I was only familiar with the domestic editions of his books. They only came out in hardcover. And one of the troops finally called them an armed services edition. So I thought there's too many letters talking about paperbacks, and now there's this armed services edition reference. So I looked it up, and I realized the U.S. government sent over 123 million paperbacks to troops during World War II, and no one seems to have remembered that this happened. And so I just felt like it was a duty almost to dig up the entire story and then write a book about it so that we would remember.
So let's go back in history just a little bit. And can you tell us what happened on May 10th, 1933 in Germany?
Sure. On May 10th, 1933 in Germany, the first and largest book burning occurred by the Nazis. And so I think 40,000 people came out to watch. They were told that there was going to be this beautiful torchlight parade hosted by university students. And there was a torchlight parade, but once the parade descended upon Berlin's main square, the torches were used to light a giant bonfire. And then for months before this event, students had been going through libraries across Berlin and selecting titles that they thought were antagonistic to the Nazi ideals, taking them off the shelves. And then automobiles arrived that night filled with books, and the students were taking the books out of the automobiles and throwing them into the fire. And this went on for hours, and students interrupted sometimes to give little speeches about different authors whose literary sins required that the books be burned. But by the end of the night, tens of thousands of books had been destroyed. And to make sure that Germany knew that this was something that was desirable by the Nazi government, it was actually filmed and made into newsreels, and they were in every movie theater. And then there ended up being about 90 plus copycat book burnings across Germany after that.
So a name that we all know, Paul Joseph Goebbels, what role did he play in all this?
In a very dramatic scene, he entered the square and he decided to give a speech, and he said, with the burning of these books, we are signifying that Jewish intellectualism is dead. That's what he said. And then he said, Germany is now on a new path towards, being more modern and being stronger by getting rid of these ideas that make us weak.
So what's interesting is he was the Minister of Enlightenment.
Yes.
And he oversaw the Chamber of Culture.
Yes, the Chamber of Culture. Yes.
So what did they do to libraries?
Libraries, their word were reorganized. And so books that they considered harmful to Germany were removed from the shelves, and they ended up publishing lists, and the list kept getting longer year after year. And there ended up being, I think, over 5,000 titles, hundreds and hundreds of authors, and then certain publishing houses, the complete works of the entire publishing house were banned. So obviously those publishing houses just closed. They couldn't produce any books. And it was just this really concerted effort to control almost every word that was available to the public. And, what were you allowed to read? What were you allowed to think? And it was really just an exercise in thought control, and it began with books.
And when they would, what I found so interesting too, is when they would conquer a new country, they would do the same thing.
They did the same thing. So in France, for example, in 1940, they first closed all the libraries because it was too big of a problem to keep them open. And then they issued lists of books that had to be removed from the shelves across French libraries. And the libraries were told that if they didn't comply, the library would just be permanently closed. It would be confiscated, or everybody that worked at the library might face dire circumstances. So most felt forced to comply, unfortunately. And
the number of titles, the authors, and the number of books, it's incredible how many.
It's incredible. When America declared war on Germany, overnight, every book by any American author was banned. All American periodicals were banned. And anyone who was an author who had any kind of ties to the United States were also banned. So just overnight, like, I don't think there's even a number for these figures, but...
So you talked about 4,000 titles, 365 authors, and the entire time period, 120 million books were destroyed.
Right. By the time the war ended, over 120 million books were destroyed across Europe.
So I love this quote that you have in here from Helen Keller. So you can kind of set it up a little bit. If you could read that quote at the bottom at the top of the next page.
So Helen Keller was a banned author. And so when word got to Helen Keller that she was banned, she wrote a letter to the student body of Germany, because after the 1933 book burning, they were the ones that orchestrated it, or at least that's what it looked like. And she was just really upset, and she was just so frustrated that such a thing could happen. And so she wrote to these students saying, you know, Germany is the home of the printing press. It's an odd thing to destroy the products of this great creation. And she said, and this is a quote, "History has taught you nothing if you think you can kill ideas. Tyrants have tried to do that often before, and the ideas have risen up in their might and destroyed them." And she said, "You can burn my books and the books of the best minds in Europe, but the ideas in them have seeped through 1,000,000 channels and will continue to quicken other minds."
It's impressive, the words of a child. Mm-hmm. So the other thing I was struck by was the book Mein Kampf was written in 1935, but it became a government-mandated reading. Is that correct?
That's correct. Every couple who married in Germany received a copy of it when they registered their marriage. It was anywhere that you could manipulate the event so that you had a copy of it. That happened.
So I sometimes think when we think about soldiers, we just think about the fighting aspect of what goes on in a war. But there's something before that. There's the quality of life in the camps, the quality of life where they're stationed, the morale of the soldiers. So tell us what was happening with the soldiers in those early days of the war.
So the United States had gone through a period of deep isolationism throughout the 1930s. And so when Poland was attacked by Germany in 1939, the United States generally felt that's a European problem. We are not going to get involved. And then even as war spilled across other borders, the United States still felt we're not getting involved. It's still a European problem. And so Congress wouldn't pass any funding to increase the size of the U.S. military. And when it did, it was so minor. Like, for example, George Marshall, who was Chief of Staff of the Army, begged Congress to please give him a budget so that we could have airplanes, have an Air Force. And Congress gave him, I think, 58 airplanes total. And so it was just impossible to raise an army until Congress came along. And so it wasn't until the fall of France in June 1940 when Congress kind of realized this might actually not be only a European problem after all. If France can fall in 6 weeks, we maybe should prepare ourselves just in case we have to go to war. And so then Congress finally passed legislation for the draft and to raise an army. But that timing was a disaster because as soon as people were being drafted, that's also when George Marshall was trying to order uniforms for them. And it takes time for uniforms and weaponry and everything that he was ordering to come in. And so troops showed up for army service, and there was no camp, there was no buildings, there were no barracks, there were no uniforms, there were no weapons. And so there were all of these stories that were coming out of these camps saying, you know, I went to the army and they gave me a uniform from World War I. And the army gave me a broomstick and told me to practice shooting with it like it's a rifle. And there were trucks that would just have a sign on it that said tank. And they were supposed to pretend. And so they got really, you know, what was the point of trying to train this way? There was one guy who was from Brooklyn, and he said, I haven't even shot a gun in a Coney Island shooting gallery. How am I going to learn to shoot with a broomstick and, you know, trucks that say tank? And so the morale in the army went just plummeted. I mean, it felt pointless, and you can't blame them for feeling that way. And so some kind of morale was needed. George Marshall, who was the chief of staff, really believed that if you had happy soldiers, they'd be better soldiers. And so he wanted to do things that would give them something to be happy about. So he pushed a recreation program through that was really comprehensive, but the problem was initially, if you don't have uniforms and you don't have barracks and you don't have these basic things that you actually need for war, you can't really run out and build some movie theaters and things like that so that they can have recreation. But books, they're portable, they're small. You don't even necessarily need a building for them. If you had boxes of books show up, you could just grab a book, take it back to your tent, because that's where you were staying that night, and read, though, in a tent under candlelight.
So tell us about Robert Troutman and what he did to try to deal with this issue.
So the chief librarian of the Army during World War II was Raymond Troutman. He just graduated from Columbia, and he had worked in the CCC before joining the Army, so in 1940. So he had some military background, and he had library knowledge, and he got pushed into this fool's errand of trying to build a library service when you had a Congress that didn't want to give funding for basic things like uniforms. So he needed to get creative in terms of figuring out how can we possibly provide books to the military when there's literally no money to purchase them. And librarians came to his rescue.
In fact, one was from Los Angeles, Aletha Warren, correct?
Yeah. So Warren was one of the most, at the time, she was known for being such a trailblazing librarian because she thought libraries should be fun. She thought you should not be shushed because you raised your voice. You should just come there and just enjoy books and have librarians who will connect you with a book that they think you will love and enjoy, because that's what libraries should do. So she joined forces with Troutman and the USO and the Red Cross, and they created something called the Victory Book Campaign. And it was the largest book drive in American history. And it had every librarian across every community come together and ask the public to please donate books, good books, so that troops would be able to read them when they were going through their military service.
And they had a goal, correct?
Yes. So in 1942, they wanted to raise 10 million books to give to troops as they were starting to train and go overseas. And then it was renewed in 1943, and they wanted to raise another 8 million books. And they did. They hit both goals.
I thought it was interesting, though, that some of the books that were sent didn't really relate. There were books about embalming and gardening and knitting,
yes,
right?
Yes. So there was a little problem with the quality control. Some people, according to some librarians, thought it was an attic cleaning opportunity. And so they just gave everything that they didn't want to read. So then they had this huge publicity campaign saying, give a book that would hurt you to give away because you loved it so much. And so just kind of having people put themselves in soldiers' shoes to the extent possible and think about what would you really want to read. And it's not cookbooks, and it's not things like that. I think The Undertaker's Review was another one that they used as a model, just being like, that's not a good book.
And one of the issues they had were these were full-size books that we're all familiar with, but they were difficult for the soldiers to transport when they were out in the field.
Exactly. So, soldiers had to carry everything that they needed on their backs. And so, especially once troops started going overseas, they'd march for miles and miles a day, carrying everything. And the field packs could be 50 to 80 pounds, depending on what role in the war you served. And so the idea of adding even a couple pounds to have a hardcover book, that's extra pounds. There's stories of people stopping along a march to open up their bags, and they would even throw away their gas masks because they felt it just was too heavy to carry. And their feet were blistered, their legs were shot, they were exhausted, and any less weight was better.
So they stopped the book drive, I think, in May of 43, and then they started something called the Armed Services Edition. Tell us what that is.
Right. So American publishers across the country had started this organization called the Council on Books in Wartime. And they had come up with this motto, books are weapons in the war of ideas. But all of their activities up to about 1943 targeted the home front and driving up book sales, which was convenient for them because they would profit off of this. And so Trautmann actually came up with this idea, Trautmann was the chief librarian, of trying to create miniature reading material that you could actually fit inside of a pocket, because that's what troops needed. And they really desperately wanted to read bestsellers, and they wanted to read books, but they couldn't carry the hardcovers. They had to have soft covers. And at the time, major publishers did not print any of their books in soft covers because they'd lose money with a profit margin. You'd sell a hardcover book for $2.50 to $4. A paperback was 25 cents. That's too much money to lose, so they refused to do it. But Trautmann created this little prototype, and it was the cutest little softcover book that you've ever seen. And he presented it to Malcolm Johnson, who was the publisher at Doubleday. And Johnson was swept away by Trautmann's argument of, you know what, soldiers would never buy a hardcover book. They would buy soft covers. So if you will do this now for the Army, you will earn an entire new audience of book readers by the time they come home from war. And Johnson was intrigued by this idea. And so he presented it to all of the publishers, and I mean every publisher was part of this organization, and they signed on. And so these books called the Armed Services Editions were born. And to show you how tiny they are, I've had one in my pocket the entire time. So here's White Fang. It truly is pocket-sized. You probably had no idea it was there. But they were printed with 2 columns of text. I don't know if you can see so well. And that was because it's easier for your eyes to read a short column of text if you have poor lighting than it is to try to get along across 6 lines of a hardcover book. But yeah, so that ended up being distributed, I think, in December 1940 through to January 1944. And at first, troops got these little containers, like they were wrapped in brown weatherproof wrappers and had twine around them, so they could actually be parachuted down. You could attach a parachute to the twine and throw them out of planes, and they would land on American positions. And troops thought, this is nice. It seems like the Army has sent us holiday gifts. Because it was right around the holidays, and the Army usually did something like that. But no, they kept coming every month after that.
And they did the same thing with magazines, right?
They did. So magazines, troops did read a lot of magazines before they became soldiers in the Army. And so Trautmann also wanted to create magazines that would be troop-friendly. And so he worked with every major magazine of the time. The Saturday Evening Post was one of the most popular. And the Saturday Evening Post managed to create the smallest magazine, I'm going to say in the history of magazines. I have one in my other pocket. Yeah. And, I mean, it's got pictures and everything. They would often include cartoons. This one has something about golfing, but it would always include the main stories that were in the magazine, and these were so small that they could fit in a helmet liner. And so troops could carry these anywhere they went. And actually, the Saturday Evening Post printed 10 million copies of each one and did it for 36 issues. So for 3 years, troops received these. And if you loved a magazine like the Saturday Evening Post, if you got a copy of it and you are far from home and nothing is in English anywhere that you look, and it was the most comforting thing that you could imagine.
So there's an interesting story in your book about the book The Great Gatsby, and how when it came out, I think in 1925, it really was pretty much a failure. But what happened during the war?
Yeah, so F. Scott Fitzgerald, when he passed away, he died thinking that The Great Gatsby was a failure. And the saddest thing is that the last royalty check he received for The Great Gatsby was based on copies of the book he had purchased himself. He thought it was the great American novel, and I think it honestly broke his heart that it seemed like the public did not agree with that. So fast forward to the Armed Services editions. So frankly, the publishers were complaining about 2 years into the program that they were scraping the bottom of the barrel trying to find titles that would be any good for a group of young men. They had already printed all the bestsellers, all the sports books, and Troutman at the Army said, find something. Like, they're reading everything that you can possibly print, just send more titles. And so I think The Great Gatsby was chosen because everyone knew who F. Scott Fitzgerald was. He had that name recognition. And so they threw it in there because they didn't have other titles to print, which is astounding probably to hear. 125,000 copies of it were printed for free and given to troops. So troops' letters were censored. You weren't allowed to say where you were. You had to say, I'm somewhere in the South Pacific. I'm somewhere in Europe. You couldn't say where you were. You couldn't say what you were doing. You couldn't say who you were with. You couldn't describe the scenery. You couldn't describe the weather. So you would just write a letter, weather's great, which is always a lie. I'm eating a lot, which also was a lie. Just all of these things to make people feel better at home. But one thing they could write that would never be censored was what books they were reading. And so troops were reading The Great Gatsby. And so they'd write home saying, currently reading The Great Gatsby. And then the only connection that they could have to their loved ones was sometimes sharing the same book. So then their loved ones would go out and buy a copy of The Great Gatsby. And now they had like a long-distance book club by letter. And so that started driving up sales of The Great Gatsby at home. Critics revisited it and said, this book's not half bad. And all of a sudden, everybody started to realize this was the great American novel. But poor F. Scott Fitzgerald did not live to know that.
So another interesting story, and the book is full of surprises, an interesting story, is the role that these books played on D-Day and the invasion of Normandy. Tell us about that.
So for D-Day, Dwight Eisenhower, he really believed in the power of books, and he personally would read Westerns to relax, even though he's orchestrating the entire war in Europe. And so he felt, if books do that for me, I want to give books to the troops too. And so he wanted all of the Armed Services editions that he could possibly get his hands on because he knew D-Day was coming. And so they stockpiled Armed Services editions before D-Day. They sent them to England, where the marshalling areas were. And there was a reporter from the New Yorker, actually, who went to cover the landing of Normandy. And he said that he was in those marshalling areas in England, and he said troops left all sorts of stuff behind: cigarettes, chocolate bars, sometimes cameras, all sorts of things. But he said there wasn't one book that had been left behind. And so the troops were already nervous about invading Normandy, but then it was delayed by a day because the weather was bad. And so they're stuck on these churning LSTs. They're all seasick. It's just the most miserable experience. The only thing that they had to distract their minds were the books that they had. And basically you're thinking about, I'm about to invade France, and Hitler's known about it the entire time, that there was going to be a French invasion, just maybe not exactly where. They felt like they were likely going to face death, and they're stuck on these churning boats that are making them seasick. Any distraction at all was a godsend. So these books meant something really special. But what's really fabulous is that the publishers, knowing that books had been banned and burned across Europe now for over 10 years, a lot of those editions that were printed in those months that went to Normandy and beyond, they were banned titles and authors whose books had been banned across Europe. So troops literally invaded with books that had been banned and burned for a decade.
So can I get you to read this one letter that one of the soldiers wrote about the impact of the books?
Oh, I love this one. So it says, "Dear Sirs," and this was written to the publishers, "I want to say thanks a million for one of the best deals in the Army, your Armed Services editions. Whenever we get them, they are as welcome as a letter from home. They are as popular as pinup girls, especially over here, where we just couldn't get books so easily if it weren't for your editions." And it was signed off by one private and the gang.
Tell us some of the other titles that were very popular books, which are surprising to think that they were for soldiers.
Yeah, so one of the most popular books was A Tree Grows in Brooklyn by Betty Smith. And Betty Smith received over 10,000 letters from troops during World War II. And her book didn't go to troops till 1943. So we're actually talking about a very short period of time. And she felt like an obligation to write back to them. And some of the most moving letters were written to Betty Smith about what that book meant to them. And troops would say, I don't even live in Brooklyn, but reading your description of Brooklyn made me feel like I was back in my hometown. And the family dynamics, it was a very dysfunctional family, but that reminded them of their dysfunctional families back at home. And even that was comforting because, all they wanted to do was get back to those families. And so she would just receive these letters that would just absolutely break your heart. And that's why she felt a duty to send responses back. But she was one of the few authors who was so popular. Back in the time, if you loved a celebrity, a soldier would write a letter being like, send me your autograph. And they would. They'd get autographed pictures of celebrities. Betty Smith was one of the few authors. She had to print photographs of herself because she was such a celebrity that troops wanted to carry her picture too.
So you reminded me of this one, you talked about the letter that was written. Can you read this right here?
So there was somebody that was, I think, in Europe, and he and his group of soldiers had one copy of A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. And I should mention, it was the policy, the unspoken policy, that you would read your Armed Services edition and then pass it on to the next person who wanted to read it because they were so precious. But this soldier wrote to Betty Smith and said, not long ago, I was down inspecting one of my batteries in a pretty tough position and was in a gun pit when some Germans started in on us with 88s. It wasn't very pleasant waiting for them to come in after their whistle first sounded and waiting for them to burst. Elsewhere, you hope. Anyway, I noticed one GI reading in between bursts. I asked him what he was reading and he told us A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. He started to read us a portion about giving the baby the Gussie, a part of the book, and we laughed like hell between bursts. It sure was funny.
So I want to fast forward. The war ends, and the nature of the books changes. So what types of books were they giving to the troops at the end of the war?
So at the end of the war, everybody was focused on coming home. And so they shifted the titles to start printing books about possible professions. And so they, do you want to be in the FBI? That was actually one of the books. There was some on journalism. Troops really appreciated the written word because they relied on it to find out what was happening around them. And also just for amusement and for recreation. So becoming a journalist, becoming a writer. Do you want to start a farm? Because under the GI Bill, the government would help you start a farm if that's what you wanted to do. How to start a small business. So all of these books that were actually really helpful and also just gave them something to hope about ended up being published towards the end of the program.
And how did all this change America when they came home?
Oh, when they came home, they had a reading habit. They described themselves as booked addicts. And so when the GI Bill promised a free education on the government's dime, what Congress had no expectation that troops were going to come home and want to learn. They thought they would take up the business, they'd do the home loans, they would start farms, but not education. They were wrong. 2.3 million returning veterans got a free education under the GI Bill. And what's amazing is a lot of deans of really big schools, like even the dean of Harvard came out against the GI Bill saying, we are going to lower educational standards by having these veterans come. Well, studies were done, and in the years after when the GI started going to school, the civilian students were complaining about having these military disciplined students in the classroom who loved to read, and they called them damned average raisers, also known as DARs.
So I want to switch now because I want to get to the second book, which is The War of Words. And at the end, I want you to be honest and tell me if any of you knew any of this occurred during World War II. So tell us about The War of Words and what the book's about. Just kind of generally tell us a little bit about what it's about.
So in interviewing veterans for When Books Went to War, there was one veteran who I ended up writing back and forth with. We were basically pen pals, who told me, you got to write a book about how newspapers and magazines went to war. And so I thought he meant Yankin Stars and Stripes. And then I already knew about the little magazines like the Post. And he said, no, we printed our own newspapers. We would write what was happening to us. We would mimeograph it. We would get it on stencils. We'd churn it out of a mimeograph machine. And we had newspapers that were by and for us. And we would write about what things that, civilians couldn't understand. So, something that was very sensitive to troops was when they lost a buddy. For them, it wasn't a number. For them, it was a human being that they had breakfast, lunch, and dinner with, and maybe that person saved their life a couple of times, and so it was deeply personal. And so the only place they usually would talk about something like that was in these newspapers they printed, because it was by and for them. And so the audience understood completely what some of these really tragic parts of service were like, because they lived them too. And so they could honor their losses, they could honor their buddies, and they could make sense of what they were sacrificing and what it was all for.
And so when you say newspapers, I mean, these really were newspapers, not published by someone in the United States or back at headquarters. They were published by
and for troops. So George Marshall, to the rescue again. He wanted them to be able to chronicle what was happening. He thought that when your name was in print, that dignified whatever you had gone through. That was a source of praise and honor to make it into the newspaper. So if you wanted to print your own newspaper in the military during World War II, you would request a publishing kit. And this crate of supplies would arrive. It would have Underwood typewriters, the mimeograph machine, paper, ink, and then some guidebooks. So there's some of these things. You'd have manuals on how to do it all, because it wasn't assumed you knew how to use a mimeograph machine. And troops just got to work. And then every 2 weeks, you'd get a fresh stock of paper and ink. And so you could just keep printing. Once your address, your APO, your Army Post Office address was on the list, you kept getting supplies for the duration. And so they printed and printed and printed.
And what was the content of these newspapers? And while you're talking, I'm just going to hold up a couple. She actually went through, again, this is going to make me cry, she went through some that she had from Okinawa to see if perhaps my father's name was in any of these. We couldn't find that. But these are what the newspapers were.
So some were more professional than others. So as troops made their way through Europe and went through Japan, they would, their word, liberate printing equipment and then use it themselves. And so they sometimes printed professionally. Sometimes they had these mimeographed newspapers, but there would be gossip in it. There would sometimes be, though, the menu. Like, for instance, even though Doug's father's not mentioned in the Okinawa newspapers, if he was there for Christmas, you can see what he ate. You can see what the Army fed everybody on Okinawa for Christmas dinner. They also shipped Christmas trees to Okinawa because they thought that would cheer everybody up to see something like a Christmas tree. So the weirdest facts come out of these things, but also there's sometimes stories about how troops tried to make their shelters nicer. And so the engineers would be in battle with one another over inventions. Like they created flooring that would circulate air in the Pacific so that it was kind of like air conditioning. And then the next unit over had to create, barbershop chairs that reclined. And so they were constantly coming up with all of these neat things, and they would report these things in their newspapers.
And they had cartoons.
They had cartoons. The cartoons would make fun of the Army. A lot of the time, one was talking about how only the Army could create a raincoat where you were more wet when you had it on than when you weren't wearing one. So there's plenty of that too.
And poetry.
So in poems, I think the troops unloaded a lot of their feelings. And I think it was because it was a safe place to do that, because the other people reading it were usually each other. But also, I think sometimes they really pushed censorship in the poetry, and I think they thought that the unit censor maybe didn't read the poems and just skipped over them.
So I have a couple that I'd love for you to read.
So So one of the problems that a lot of men faced was that, they had girlfriends and loved ones who they left behind. Will you write me? Of course I'll write to you. And then the love kind of fizzled away as time went on. And so one man who experienced exactly that decided to write a poem about it, and it was called My Girl and Me. And it went like this. Dear John begins her letter, but the way she used to start was, dearest darling Johnny boy, my very own sweetheart. I would have written sooner, but I'm busy, that is why. I know she must be busy, and I wonder who's the guy. The weather's very pleasant, and I hope you're feeling well. What a difference from the things she always used to tell. Her letter ends sincerely. Boy, now isn't she a pal? The income tax collector writes as friendly as my gal. And then he says, how fickle is the female sex, an untrue dame is she. My sweetheart, how can I ever forget how much you mean to me? Oh, what ho, it's after 9, and I don't want to make her wait. I mean the pretty PX girl with whom I have a date.
There was just one more I wanted you to read. This one.
Oh, and some of them were really heartbreaking. So homesickness was a common theme in newspapers. In fact, one of the newspapers had the title, The Homewrecker, and it was for a separation center. So as soon as you entered the Army, you went to a separation center. And it was just hard to adjust to the Army, especially since, this was an army of people who didn't choose the military. The military chose them. They were drafted. It wasn't a question of, do you want to be here? It was a statement of, you will be here. And that was really hard for people to give up their family ties and all their creature comforts and be in the military. So this poem was called Strictly GI. And this man wrote, here I sit on my GI bed with my GI hat upon my head, my GI pants, my GI shoes, all is free, nothing to lose. GI razor, GI comb, gee, I wish that I was home.
So there were also letters to the editor. So tell us about Corporal Rupert Trimmingham.
So Corporal Rupert Trimmingham was a black soldier who was in the United States. The U.S. military actually refused to allow most black troops to go overseas because they had a policy of strict racial segregation, and they didn't know how exactly they were going to maintain racial segregation during a battle. So most black troops had to stay in the United States, and he was one of them, and he was training in Arizona, and he was sent on special army business to Louisiana. So the Army put him on a train. He made the trip to Louisiana. He and the little group that was sent with him, they did whatever the task was, which was an Army secret because he never mentioned it. And then he needed to get back on the train, but he wanted to grab something to eat before the long trip back to Arizona. And
maybe you can read his letter.
And so he said, he and his fellow soldiers found out that they could not purchase a cup of coffee at any of the lunchrooms because, as you know, old man Jim Crow rules. And this was a letter that Trimmingham wrote to the editor of Yank the Army Weekly. And then he went on to say, the only place where we could be served was at the lunchroom at the railroad station, but of course, we had to go into the kitchen. But that's not all. 11:30 a.m., about 24 German prisoners of war with 2 American guards came to the station. They entered the lunchroom, sat at the tables, had their meal served, talked, smoked, in fact, had quite a swell time. I stood on the outside looking in, and I could not help but ask myself these questions. Are these men sworn enemies of this country? Are they not taught to hate and destroy all democratic governments? Are we not American soldiers sworn to fight for and die, if need be, for this our country? Then why are they being treated better than we are? Why are we pushed around like cattle? If we are fighting for the same thing, if we are going to die for our country, then why does the government allow such things to go on? And so he closed his letter to Yank saying, for me and all other black soldiers, we're wondering, what are we fighting for? And of course, the Army was very concerned with that question. They even had Frank Capra produce films called, Why Are We Fighting and What Are We Fighting For? And so the Trimmingham bet Yank, you won't publish this. I know you won't. My buddies say you won't too. And they did. So they published it, and then the thing about Yank is that they had these giant pages, and they'd be full, 2 or 3 pages would be full of letters to the editor, but then responses. And so a few weeks after his letter was printed, soldiers around the world wrote their impressions of the letter. And it was astounding because black troops were starting to go overseas. And for the units that actually fought side by side with black troops, white troops and black troops, they realized we're all great fighters. And they also realized we have one enemy in common, and it's not each other. And so they were actually really upset to read that American soldiers were being treated so disrespectfully. And so there was a huge backlash against the racial segregation policy of the military. And a lot of that had to do with Yank having the courage to print this letter from Sergeant Trimmingham.
So next I want you to tell us about the mimeographed one-page edition of the 42nd Rainbow Infantry Division World News dated May 1st, 1945.
So May 1st, 1945 was just on the cusp of VE Day. And so American forces were rushing towards Germany and Berlin. And as the 42nd Division was going towards Berlin, a reporter actually stopped them and said, "Aren't you going to go to Dachau?" And they happened to have some high-ranking members of the 42nd Division there, and they said, well, where is it? We'll take a reading on the situation. So they did, I think it was an 8-mile detour from where they were and went to Dachau. And the 42nd Division that day liberated the Dachau concentration camp. But because they had been printing newspapers the entire time, they had a newspaper staff with them. So they had a bunch of seasoned journalists. They had a illustrationist who was able to draw anything. They also had a photographer whose name was William Haphazard, and so they just called him Haphazard. So Haphazard was there. And they were told by a general, I want you to document everything that you see, and tonight I want you to print a newspaper that documents precisely the way it was. And the idea was, we don't want to wait 3 weeks when the civilian correspondents come in and the conditions are better. We want you to document exactly what it's like right now. And so they ended up printing this one-page mimeograph newspaper that overnight into the next day, and it had exactly one headline, and that was just Dachau.
And maybe you could read part of it.
So it begins by saying, Dachau is no longer a name of terror for hunted men. 32,000 of them have been freed by the 42nd Rainbow Division. The crimes done behind the walls of this worst of Nazi concentration camps now live only to haunt the memories of the Rainbow Men who tore open its gates and first saw its misery, and to accuse its SS keepers of one of the worst crimes in all of history. When infantrymen of the 42nd Division fought their way into Dachau against fanatical SS troops who met deserved violent deaths along the moats, behind the high fences and in the rail yards littered with the bodies of 50 carloads of their starved victims, these hardened soldiers expected to see horrible sights. Riflemen, accustomed to witnessing death, had no stomach for rooms stacked almost ceiling high with tangled human bodies adjoining the cremation furnaces, looking like some maniac's woodpile. And when an officer pressed through the mobs of the forgotten men of all nations inside the electric barbed wire enclosure and entered a room where lay the dying survivors of the horror train, he wept unashamedly as limp ghosts under filthy blankets tried to salute him with broomstick arms, falling back in deathly stupor from which most would never rouse. And it goes on for quite a while, actually. And at the end, the author of this is just trying to make sense. Like, how can human beings treat other human beings like that? Like, it just didn't make sense. And he was just saying it was incredible that such things could happen today. But there was the visible proof. And it was unbelievable that human beings were capable of perpetrating such unspeakable atrocities. But there were the men who did it, the SS. And he said, those tortured dead can only be avenged when our world is aroused so much by what the 42nd uncovered at Dachau, and by what others have found at all the other Dachaus scattered throughout Germany, that never again will any party, any government, any people be allowed to mar the face of the earth with such inhumanity.
So we just have a minute or two left. There's so much more that I wanted to talk about, so many more poems. But maybe we can end with you talking a little bit about Dean Chattenkane and a battle in 1943 in southern Tanzania. And I'll have you read his poem, but tell us a little bit about him.
So he was a soldier who was kind of the unit's poet. He would write poems that helped them feel better about going through the separation situation, to go through basic training and stuff like that. But he found himself in North Africa, and he was in a tank with his buddies, and the tank was hit. And so he crawled out of the tank, which was burning. He ended up having to amputate his own leg with a jackknife to get out from the tank because he was stuck in it and it was going to probably explode. And so as he lay there on the ground, he assumed he was going to die because there was no one there to help him. He wrote a poem because that's what he always did. That's what he would do anytime he was going through something. And this was directed at the home front. And he said, "What did you do today, my friend, from morn until the night? How many times did you complain that rationing is too tight? Were you going to start to do all the things you say? A soldier would like to know, my friend, what did you do today?" And then he said, my gunner died in my arms today. I feel his warm blood yet. Your neighbor's dying boy gave out a scream I can't forget. On my right, a tank was hit, a flash and then the fire. The stench of burning flesh still rises from the pyre. What did you do today, my friend, to help us with the task? Did you work harder and longer for less, or is that too much to ask? What right have I to ask you this, you probably will say. Maybe now you'll understand. You see, I died today.
So thank you, Molly. Thank you. These books are fabulous and wonderful. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Jamie. Thanks so much. Thank you.
You're so good. You really are.
Thanks,
you are
Doug.
so good.
Well, I don't know. I feel like I could talk with you all day about these books. I really could.